And now we will have Mr. Job Snijders ranting about something, I'm assuming.
No.
So please give Job a big round of applause.
All right, let's get some slides up. I will warm up the crowd with what I consider one of the best jokes, and it applies to this presentation. Why do you never see elephants hiding in a tree? Ah, exactly. All right, we're going to talk about hiding. In this presentation, I'm going to go through some risks I perceive around RPKI, measures I, with my RPKI client project, have taken so far to mitigate those risks, some solutions I have in mind, and then we can get to some Q&A. So, threats to RPKI, and I'm not going to talk about political threats or centralization, or what if I don't pay my bill, or what if I don't use two-factor authentication on my RIPE account. I'm going to talk about hacking the RPKI validators themselves. If you look at the ecosystem, you have academic people that have a paper quota and that are working very hard to contribute to their own quota rather than the state of science. There is three-letter agencies, I assume, who are taking a close look at RPKI because it can impact international connectivity. I myself joined this crowd, and there's of course operators that push buttons until it works, and they could be the attackers themselves by accident. It's too bad Tom Strix is not here. Tom, if you're watching. So why can RPKI validators even be hacked? What is the scenario that leads up to this? Now, keep in mind, and I've anonymized, the ISPs here. Every validator, is primed with a number of trust anchor locators, and those contain URLs to a certificate that contains a signature, and if the signature checks out, you follow the URLs in that certificate, and then so on and on. So every validator contacts the RIPE repository, assuming the validator loaded the RIPE TAL, and it fetches data, processes it, and continues. Now, you can delegate authority for resources, for IP addresses, for ASNs, for many IP addresses, for single IP addresses. So in this schematic overview, I instructed RIPE NCC to delegate authority for my resources to my publication point. And this means that after the validators contacted RIPE's repository and slurped in all the data, they'll find a reference to my repository and connect to my repository, and I can feed them any data I want. So this is sort of where the attack vector starts to show up. With DNS, you only ask questions about stuff you're interested in, right? So it's a pool protocol. With RPKI, you slurp in everything, and you hope that there's something of value somewhere hidden in what you slurped in. In terms of delegations, this is from earlier this morning at 8 a.m. as I was struggling to generate this image, and Alan was waiting for me to submit these slides. Good coordination. But there's many delegations in the ecosystem already today. This is not a fake thing. It is a key part of how RPKI works, and it's used for great purposes such as experimentation and development of new RPKI standards like ASPA. But there's also academic researchers that are sort of looking how they can disrupt the ecosystem around RPKI and then publish papers and meet their quota. I'm super impressed by the scientific people in this regard. The key thing here is we install RPKI validators in order to reject RPKI invalid routes in BGP to increase the security and reliability of the network. But those validators, in and of themselves, bring new risks to the table that are less well understood. Repositories can serve poison pills, so to speak. If I know that somebody's validator is going to connect to me, I can feed them anything I want. And people are researching this. So for instance, the Fort validator some time ago had a buffer overflow in a specific function, and you could craft a syntactically invalid ROA, but you could feed it to the validator, and the Fort validator would choke on this ROA, and you could use that as a launchpad towards system compromise. Of course, Fort is not the only one. The Rust project Routinator has also seen a number of security issues over the years. Not buffer overflows in this instance, but like a logic error that could cause downstream effects in the sense that it could cause the RTR sessions to go down, which means that the routers are now running without RPKI data, which means that you increase your likeliness of successfully doing hijacks. A lot of research has gone into this over the last few years, and this is a slide I stole from other people. And basically all projects have had security incidents, except of course mine. Fingers crossed. No, that's not entirely true. They only listed problems they knew about, and I have found issues in my software and fixed them, so they didn't count for this particular overview. So in short, all validators at some point in time will have issues. We can worry about crashing the validator, which would flip the route from valid to not found because ROA information is missing if the validator is gone. You know, that's nasty, but it's also sort of, you know, the fallback. Like when you turn off the validators, your network just operates continuous operation without RPKI. What's trickier is if the operating system itself can be compromised with the validator's entry point. Like that is super nasty stuff, because from that moment on, it's like you have an unauthorized IBGP session in your network and people can insert things they should not be inserting. My concern at some time is that if people perceive RPKI to be more of a hassle, more of a risk than the reward that it gives us and helps stabilize internet operations, that they turn off RPKI, and that would really set back the clock on routing security. So I think this topic of how do we secure validators, or how do we approach the topic of validator insecurity is very important. So for the sake of what I'm going to present after this slide, let's assume every year, every validator suffers some vulnerability. Now, if an attacker knows which validators impact which ISPs, it gives them leverage, because from that moment on, they can attack specific validator instances to disrupt a specific ISP and then help bootstrap a BGP hijack. And a fun artifact is that on the internet there currently are a few thousand validators. There's a few tens of repositories. There is no guarantee that there's any-to-any connectivity between the validators and the repositories. It is possible that, you know, between your validator and the right repository, there's one line card on the path that is just broken and your packets are not getting through. Why this matters, we'll get to later. So, as I mentioned before, every validator connects to every repository, and repositories can refer to other repositories. So I can just look at my web server's access log and I can see the IP addresses of all the validators connecting to me. Now I can feed all these validators different ROAs, and then I can go to like route views and see which ISPs have are acting on which ROAs. So, you know, if I give everybody a ROA that invalidates my BGP announcement, except for one IP address, I give them a different ROA that actually validates my announcement, I can start to triangulate where validators are located and how they impact the network. So what can be done about this? For example, in RPKI clients, we have implemented a number of strategies to minimize risk. So one of the approaches is ASN1 and X509 and DER parsing is done using well-known cryptographic libraries like OpenSSL and LibreSSL. And this is fantastic because there's hundreds of research entities looking at those libraries, trying to find issues in the processing of certificates. So we benefit from the collective fuzzing and review that happens in that space. Another cool thing to do is sandboxing on either file system level or even system call level. The validator starts, it reads a little bit of configuration, and then it tells the kernel, from now on in the program flow, I only need access to this one directory that is my temporary cache scribbling directory, and I don't need access to anything else on the system. And then when the kernel detects, oh, you're trying to access a file like /etc/password, it kills the process because that violates a signal the process gave earlier on that they only needed access to the cache directory. So sandboxing is super cool, and it runs on both BSD and Linux, and this is very helpful. Randomization in a lot of the control paths. So when you resolve a repository and look for other work to do, like what is the list of ROAs I need to process, or are there certificates pointing to other repositories? If you walk that every time in the same order, an attacker could maybe figure out what the order is of a specific implementation, and if it's like alphabetical order, they could, for instance, try and generate a key pair where the public key component starts with an advantage if there's alphabetical ordering. So instead, we every time there is a list of things like a to-do list, and the order of things is not relevant and doesn't have semantic meaning in the RPKI. In RPKI client, the list is randomized and then handed over for further processing. So this, even if an attacker would be successful, they'd only be successful once out of every n iterations. Then there is a concept called boxing things in. So there's a time limit on how long repositories can take to download or synchronize, how large the files can be, how large the repositories can be, how long the certificate change can be. Like there's all these aspects where potential DOS factors exist, and you put a limit on it so that a single repository cannot disrupt the entire program. Cool. Another approach we've taken is called separation of privileges. The program starts, and it starts a number of sub-processes, and each sub-process is confined to, with, for instance, unview or landlock or pledge, to specific privileges. So, for instance, there's a process that sets up the TLS connection, but that same process does not do XML parsing. And this is cool because the process that sets up the TLS connection is a part of a sub-process that has the privilege to establish network connections. And if an attacker finds an issue in the XML parser, they can try and insert the bad thing to trick the XML parser, but the XML parser doesn't have access to the network, nor does it have access to the disk. So even if there's an exploit in that particular segment of the code, it's sandboxed to a point where the attacker cannot use it to bootstrap and get a reverse shell or whatnot going on. RPKI client is the only one that uses separation of privileges across multiple sub-processes. But what else is there to do? Now, I think, and this may be a little bit radical, that we should look at hiding validators. Because I think we have pushed the envelope on how secure we can make the program itself. And I think data has shown we've gotten very, very far, and the principles applied are strong. It's similar principles that are used in for instance, OpenSSH. But what if it's not enough? What if somebody finds something and they still continue down the path of attacking a specific ISP by attacking that specific validator? So I would argue, in the RPKI protocols, the only thing that matters is that data goes from the publication point to the validator, but it's not relevant for the working of the protocol that the publication point knows the source IP address of the validator. And what I mentioned before, if you know the IP addresses of a validator and you know which validators at which IP addresses operate for a certain ISP, then that ISP is at a disadvantage. So conceptually, internet-wide multicast would have been great for the RPKI use case, but we don't have internet-wide multicast, so we can't use that. Strength is in numbers. What I have been studying the last few weeks is putting validators behind Tor and using the Tor network to exit into the real internet, and using those validators behind Tor to feed, for instance, the default source of stay RTR. Now, a second thing that needs to be researched. As I mentioned, the publication point doesn't need to know the source IP addresses of the things that fetch data from the publication point. We can put in a caching layer that is inside the Tor network, caches that use FQDNs that end with .onion, so that if you want to fetch data from, say, RIPE's repository, instead of connecting directly via the internet to RIPE's repository, use Tor and you exit with via an exit node, and your IP address every time you make a connection is going to be different. But a second layer of obfuscation in this space is that instead of connecting to RIPE's repository via Tor, is that you connect to a forward proxy hosted inside Tor, so that you're never even making a connection to the RIPE repository using Tor. And this works because RRDP, the RPKI distribution protocol, is a highly cacheable protocol. It's static files that are pre-generated, so it's perfect to put that data into forward proxies and not even hit the origin, which is RIPE in this instance. So how good or bad is this? I have set up a number of validators. Some of them directly connect to the repositories and operate just like apt-get install RPKI clients, and some of them are running behind Tor. And the graph that you see is the number of validated ROA payloads over time. So the vertical axis is the number of payloads that is retrieved out of the system, and the horizontal axis is as time goes by. And what you can see is that the 5 instances are super close to each other with their outputs. And this is because there's minute differences, because all of them run at slightly different timers. So one might start at like the top of the hour, and the next instance might end up running 30 seconds past the top of the hour, and so on. So there's minute differences based on timing, and that's okay. It's unavoidable, but it's fine. And this is why the line is not a singular line that is the exact same at all times. But it does show that the 5 instances, whether they're using Tor or not, very closely approximate each other. In other words, they are delivering the same results as with and without Tor. So that's very good news. The other thing to note here is that the Tor network generally doesn't appear to be as reliable as direct connections in the general case. But conversely, there are instances that are in harder to reach parts of the world that have issues connecting to some repositories on the other side of the world. And using Tor actually helps those nodes, because instead of always trying the same direct path where there might be some kind of issue, if you use Tor, every time you try and connect, you use a different path with a different exit node on a different continent or a different ISP. So it's a bit weird, but using Tor increases the number of connection failures per day. And let's assume that per day you're doing, say, 6 times 24 synchronization attempts. But if there is brokenness in a sort of steady state, then Tor may help resolve the steady state brokenness. So Tor is a nice randomizing factor in whether you can reach or not reach a certain repository, but as it serves as an overlay with different exit points every time you connect, you increase your chances of being able to successfully synchronize with the repositories. So it's interesting. Now, going forward, what do we do with this knowledge, Job? I feel wiser, but it's not actionable. I think next up on my to-do list is figuring out if we can generalize the mechanism of forward proxies for the RPKI. There's benefits in using forward proxies because it would reduce the burden placed on RPKI repositories. Why this matters, for instance, for the last 8 days, the Japanese NIR JPNIC has had scaling issues with their RPKI repository servers. They're overloaded. Had there been the concept of forward proxies, it may have taken off load to the point that whatever setup they have continues to work rather than what we see now. Can those forward proxies be put inside Tor so that the requests never even leave the Tor environment? This is an area of experimentation, and I need to spend some time on that. Other open questions are what to do with transport failovers. Validators these days will try RRDP, which is a TLS HTTP-based synchronization protocol. If that doesn't work, TLS certificate expired or XML encoding error or connection timeout, whatever, it will try rsync. And rsync is super cool because it works really well in low bandwidth environments. So using both approaches, one after the other in a preferential order, seems to me to increase reliability of the overall system. But how that exactly interacts with Tor, it needs to be studied a little bit more. Another thing I think needs to happen is the Tor software, a Tor implementation should be put inside RPKI validators so that operators install the software like they've always done, and out of the box this connection type becomes available rather than setting up a Tor daemon with a SOX to HTTP proxy and then the validator process using the proxy. The hoops I had to jump through to produce a proof of concept are of sufficient height that I don't think it is feasible to promote this on internet scale. But if we put Tor capabilities inside validators, it becomes a whole different story, and you can just tell people, install the software, or even better, update your software, and you're done. So I hope that that is the direction that we can eventually move to. Now, small request for consideration, I'm going around with my hat. In order to further study this and experiment with it at scale, it is useful to have resources distributed over this planet that can be forward proxies in and outside of Tor, and can run validators to see if their measurements align with what other validators in other ISPs and countries are seeing. So if you're a cloud provider and you're like, sure, Job, you can have an account and some VMs, then send me an email and I will be happy to take your offer and use that for research. Now, we are getting to the end of my presentation. I think there is about 5 minutes left. So bring it on. Tomatoes, questions?
No questions?
Everybody is like,
one
yep,
question?
Yep. Tor inside validators. That makes perfect sense, Joe. We have no questions. Thank you.
You mentioned using Tor. How do you get around the fact that so many people try to block Tor?
That is a great question. From my observations, the blockage for the well-known list of Tor exit nodes is not present in the RPKI ecosystem. So I have found no issues using Tor exit node IP addresses to synchronize with repositories.
And how much resources and hosting are you looking for? You just want a VM with some disks somewhere, or do you need shitloads of
No.
storage?
This is super modest. I think a few gigs of RAM, 2 cores, and a few gigabytes of disk. That's very helpful. The challenge is more in getting good geographic distribution to really look at this. Like, does it work from all angles? Will it work for everyone, or will this anonymization trick only work for people in Amsterdam? Like, I want good answers on how does it work globally.
Hello, I'm Nicholas from Nordic. My question here is, we're looking into this, and this seems like we're building security by obscurity on top of RPKI. And is it not reasoning to say is that we're reaching the limits of what we can use RPKI on? You mentioned a new solution earlier today, but is it not where we need to rethink what we're doing? Because this seems like we're building a lot of obscurity into a solution to try and solve some security issues and make it better, but making it very complex.
Complexity is job security, so. I think you raised a good question, but my inspiration actually came from something most of us are using. Like Apple Private Relay is using oblivious HTTPS that is basically a 2-layer proxying service to obfuscate the source IP addresses of phones. And I thought to myself, like, they must be doing this for some reason. Maybe those reasons could apply to RPKI validators as well. And I will accept that should the outcome of the continued studies in this area indeed prove like, okay, the complexity versus risk mitigation benefits, it's not worth it. Yeah, maybe that's the conclusion. I don't know yet. I am a little bit optimistic, but certainly it cannot. Certainly, implementing Tor inside a validator is complexity, and I think the only way to really figure out like is it worth it is by really trying it.
Sounds good. We will hear in a few DKNOGs, I guess. So sounds good. Thank you.
Was it job or job security?
Yes. Yeah.
Job security. So Aleksi Suhonen from Finland. It may be that some of Julia's paranoia is rubbing off on me, but when you said that you'd want to try and set up a Squid or other web proxy inside the Tor network, I'm immediately worried that if it's a proxy set up for this purpose, then the potential attacker will know who is setting it up and doesn't need a lot of social engineering to find out where it's set up, and then can just DOS that location and defeat the whole purpose.
Yeah, I think if there were like one proxy, that might be a risk, but I envision a design where there's multiple operated by whoever wants to operate them. Built into the RPKI technology stack already today is a lot of replay detection and mitigation. So even if you connect to a bad proxy, it's absolutely not the end of the world. And this already happens today. Like RIPE-NCC serves out the RPKI content via a few CDNs, and it has happened that like in one region of the world, the Anycasted CDN node was behind compared to the other CDNs. It was still caching something and it could not fetch from the origin the latest version. So in effect, in that region of the world, you see what the validator considers a replay attack, but it's also part of normal operations. So validators already today are prepared to connect to trashy locations and deal with whatever garbage they find there. So I think having forward proxies doesn't really change the dynamics much, but I hear. Yeah.
Another worry is that if you are planning to have a fallback on direct connections if Tor fails, then if somebody wants to target mal content for your validator, they can just start identifying Tor exits and then block them so that you have to drop back to direct connections, and then you're back to square one.
Yeah, and I think the only mitigation is either rsync through Tor, which you mentioned can be blocked, or forward proxies in Tor, so that even if the outbound connection fails, there is a way to get to fresh data. But yeah, these are things that need to be fully understood.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Last question.
Theo from Interlink, what do you think are the odds that especially enterprises will adopt RPKI through Tor as somewhat, in some areas, debatable system in their operational kind of business?
If I do this my way, operators would never know that Tor is in the validator. Right. It's this is why I want to explore putting it in the validator, because at that point you just install it like you always did, and instead of direct connections, it's doing some other trickery. But yeah, writing the how-tos like install the Tor daemon, do this, do this, do this, that's not going to work. So it needs to be a fully integrated, out-of-the-box experience where, with or without Tor, it's the exact same workflow. And I think only in that way we'd get people on board, because they're using default settings, and default settings could be that Tor is used.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was just thinking about the question that it introduces a somewhat political component to RPKI, especially when you look at like government organizations, enterprises, and so on.
Yeah, maybe. Let's not call it Tor, we'll call it onion routing, and then everybody's like, sure, that sounds fine. All right, thank you all for your time.
Please give you a big round of applause. There you go.
2 of them?
2 small ones. It's 1 big.
Really? All right, yeah. 1 for each hand. Thank you.